We live in a drugified ecosystem that conspires against our own health and well-being. But people with addiction, they're going to die if they don't figure that stuff out. The biggest thing I have to warn people of is that they are going to feel worse before they feel better.
But I've also seen people with addiction do really shitty things. I've done really shitty things.
I agree with you, and I think it is a collective problem. We can't just rely on an individual's willpower. Your brain will be screaming out for that exogenous dopamine, and it will take a while for your brain to get the message, oh, I'm not getting it from outside anymore. I have to start regenerating my own.
Our guest today, MD, Professor of Psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and Chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. I think of her as the Duchess of Dopamine. Her book on that topic is such a good read. I've been obsessed with her work researching this to the point where literally my girlfriend's got a bit jealous. I think the other thing that stands out listening to Dr. Anna Lembke on various podcasts is her warmth. For kind of, you don't often get that combination of a guest who's extremely academic, the peer-reviewed journals, all that kind of stuff, but very warm and human with it. And I also think this is such important work. I literally sent a copy of one of her videos from another podcast to my niece, who's just sort of hitting her teenage years. And I said, you don't want to end up like Uncle Mark with all his addictions, as he's, now in sobriety, as most listeners will know. So, Dr. Anna, if I may, you are very, very welcome.
Oh, thank you. What a warm and lovely introduction. I appreciate it.
So our culture says that to be happy, we should get exactly what we want, have an easy life, and just have lots of yummy things. That's the recipe for happiness, right?
That's right. That's what our culture says.
Oh dear. Because I heard this other woman that said the relentless pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain leads to pain. That quote of yours just hit me like a rock when I saw that. The relentless pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain leads to pain. Maybe you could give us the basics of your work on dopamine.
Yeah. So, I mean, that understanding of human nature has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's not new. What is new and pretty exciting is that we now have neuroscience to back it up, showing that indeed, when we relentlessly pursue things that are highly reinforcing, i.e., pleasurable, rewarding to our mammalian brains, we increase the release of a specific neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is our pleasure, reward, motivation, and movement neurotransmitter. And we do it at a tempo and a volume that our brains were not evolved for. So we were essentially evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger in which we would have to work extremely hard to get a tiny little bit of reward. Now we can sit on the couch, swipe right, swipe left, and have it delivered digitally right to our brains. So this is very problematic for our brains. And as a result, basically what the neuroscience is showing us based on animal studies and also imaging studies in humans with addiction compared to healthy controls is that in response to this fire hose of dopamine as released by our ingestion and engagement of these highly pleasurable substances and activities, is that our brains are compensating by downregulating dopamine production and transmission, not just to our baseline level of dopamine firing, but actually below baseline into a dopamine deficit state. And that dopamine deficit state is akin to a clinical depression. It's akin to clinical anxiety. It's the state of craving, the state of wanting, the state of restlessness, insomnia, irritability. So we're actually making ourselves more miserable in our pursuit of pleasure.
So what comes up must come down, and it doesn't just come down to the start level. It goes down a bit below, kind of like a heartbeat, as I've seen, or sometimes I've seen you do a balance. So I happen to have a perfectly instant black stick here. And for audio only listeners, there's a little bit of lever on one end and feather at the other of our black stick, and it goes down with the pleasure end gets pushed down, and then you sometimes say the gremlins jump on the other side, and they hold down the other end. And it takes a little while to come back to equilibrium.
Yes.
And generally in modern culture, we don't have that little while. I just go back on my social media, or I have another drink, or I have a whatever it is. So even though we have all this abundance, we're continuously getting worse and worse and worse.
Yes, exactly. By the way, I'm really curious, what is that thing?
Well, this is a spanking stick, and I
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
quick
Did
quick
you?
story. My girlfriend walked in into my office earlier and saw this and thought I'd become an OnlyFans star. And I said no. I thought it was an appropriate tool for pleasure and pain to
Yes.
represent Dr. Anna, and I had to convince her I wasn't now doing OnlyFans. So
Right, right.
yeah,
So it took some persuasion. Well, you know what? That stick is actually a really nice segue into talking about, yes, this pleasure pain balance. So what neuroscientists have discovered is that pain and pleasure are actually co-located in the brain. The same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work in a very simplified way, like opposite sides of the balance. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way; pain, it tips the other. But it is an oversimplification, and that stick that spanking stick is a perfect example, because there are lots of things that we do that combine pleasure and pain, right? Like certain forms of sexual activity involve both pleasure and pain simultaneously, or eating spicy food is pleasure and pain simultaneously. So,
let's talk about kink. I'm going to jump in. When I heard you say on multiple kind of TED Talks and podcasts and things that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain, I thought, why is there not a whole chapter on kink in this woman's amazing book? It's amazing. There should be a chapter on it. So generally, it's the things that are pleasurable, the drug, the social interaction, the online, the porn, whatever it is.
right.
But it could also be that there's things that are painful, right? And why do we like things that are painful? I had a cold shower this morning. My Italian girlfriend thought that hugging me after the cold shower should have the same impact. I explained to her that it doesn't. Um, but I like the gym. That's kind of hard. Maybe these are sort of
Yeah.
substitute addictions. Why do we like hard things as well as nice things?
Well, we're really wired for striving. We're wired for pain. So at baseline, we're supposed to have to work very hard to get a little bit of dopamine, and we get it indirectly that way, right? We have to work for it, and then we get it as an after response, essentially because the body senses injury, however minor. Even exercise is actually immediately toxic to cells. The body senses injury and then upregulates or starts to make more of our own endogenous feel good neurotransmitters like dopamine, like serotonin, like norepinephrine, like our endogenous opioids, our endogenous cannabinoids. So we make all of those things that we tend to get addicted to. And the things we get addicted to are just exogenous, external, and much more potent and much more abundant without any work. And that is essentially the problem. So, in general, it's much better to get your high by having to work up front for it first, get it indirectly, and get it in the modest amounts that our body can generate it. Because if we don't do that, then we actually become insensitive to our own endogenous feel good neurotransmitters, right? They're no longer remotely potent enough. We've also downregulated them, as I talked about with the dopamine, because we're getting so much from the outside. So that's why things like a cold shower and exercise, although painful in the moment, they do increase those feel good neurotransmitters, often for hours afterwards before coming back down to baseline. And we never go into that dopamine deficit state because, again, we paid for it up front. We're not in the negative for the pleasure that we indulge in. Having said that, people actually can get addicted to kink or other forms of physical pain. Um, I had a patient who sort of almost got addicted to cold water immersion as he kept upping the ante on ever more rigorous ways to cool his meat locker bathtub that he was immersing himself in. Um, we see people often now addicted to exercise, especially when
Mm.
combined with restrictive dieting, which is another form of asceticism or what we call hormesis. Hormesis is the scientific area of studying how painful or noxious stimuli can make an organism more resilient if it's at the right dose, right? So the right dose is not too little and not too much. Finding that sweet spot for a given individual is really important. And then finally, I would just add that we must always consider the unique interindividual variability of our brains, which is to say, what releases a lot of dopamine directly or indirectly in one person's brain may not do so in another person's brain, right? So alcohol does absolutely nothing for me, but as
Yeah.
I talk, but as I talk about in my book, romance, sex, that whole realm is very reinforcing. I do not get a high indirectly from cold showers, but exercise is sort of my go-to source of healthier dopamine. So we're all really different, and that unique wiring can also have a huge impact on what we gravitate toward.
Wonderful. So there's this evolutionary mismatch, as it were, between the kind of modern conditions. I've also definitely seen a lot of recovering alcoholics. Listeners probably know I'm in long-term alcohol recovery, long-term sober. And I've seen a lot of recovering alcoholics get into really hardcore exercise.
Yes.
And it's certainly a lot of listeners that listen to this podcast like things like breath work and intense yoga. I've seen hot yoga be an addiction for people, these very strong stimuli in the kind of somatic world, in the world of different kind of practices of body mind that can be really quite intense. So we're certainly, our community certainly not immune to these. If anything, I'd say we have our drugs packaged slightly differently. Um, you brought up something there that I'm really curious about personally, which is this idea of sort of specificity or how generalized addictive tendencies would be. Like, I seem to be a sort of an addictive person generally. My addictions jump around, but there's also specificity. Like alcohol, I was hooked on almost from the moment I started drinking. Cannabis just never got me, even though my best mate smoked loads of weed and it was around me every day. So is there are addictions more prevalent in some people in a more generalized way, or does it tend to be more specific, would you say?
Oh, great question. I would say both. So it's very clear that some people come into this world more vulnerable to the problem of addiction than others. And family and twin studies would support the idea that about 50 to 60% of the risk of getting addicted is genetic. It's obviously a complex polygenic phenomenon. There's not like one gene for addiction, but it's very clear that some people are more vulnerable to the problem of compulsive overconsumption than others. I should probably stop here and just define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. There's no brain scan or blood test right now to diagnose addiction. It's based on phenomenology or patterns of behavior that repeat themselves across individuals, time periods, cultures, etc. It's a spectrum disorder. On the extreme end of addiction, a child off the street could tell you that there's something wrong, but most of us fall sort of somewhere on that low, somewhere on that spectrum, but not necessarily the extreme end, the life-threatening end. And then there's kind of the pre-addicted state, which I think really we're all in, frankly, in this day and age, with our devices and all of the drugified food and drugified sex and social media and so on. But anyway, so yeah, so definitely there's a genetic risk, an inborn risk. There's also probably a risk. There's definitely a risk based on how you're raised. So if you have serious childhood trauma, really in any form, that can increase the risk of addiction. But the other major risk is also your environment, right? If you live in a neighborhood where drugs are readily available, where people use them frequently, where your culture normalizes them, then you're more likely to use them, more likely to get addicted. On the issue of specificity or drug of choice, specifically in your case, knowing from the first moment that you drank alcohol that you loved it, which I often hear from people who become alcoholics, and that despite all your friends smoking cannabis, it never did anything for you. Yeah, this is again, the fascinating, unique wiring between us. And there's interestingly very little research or neuroscience on specificity or drug of choice. I'm hoping that my neuroscience colleagues will delve into that because I think it's a really interesting area. It's manifesting, just to again sort of reflect on nature versus nurture here a little bit more. For most of recorded history, women outpaced men in terms of addiction to drugs and alcohol. So you could infer from that that there's a genetic difference in risk between men and women when it comes to alcohol and drug addiction. On the other hand, what we're seeing in millennials is that the rate of alcohol addiction is 1 to 1 for the first time. So, really, that then suggests that it's not actually a genetic difference between men and women, but it's a cultural difference. And that with cultural emancipation and normalization of alcohol consumption among women and maybe additional pressures on them now because of their emancipated roles in society, they're now as vulnerable as men are to addiction. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And when we look at digital media, we see an overwhelming proportion of people addicted to online pornography and online video games are boys and men. And more in general, more girls and women get addicted to social media. So again, it's interesting to
Yeah, there's a
think
few
about.
factors. A few factors. I've heard it argued both ways. Some people say if you have an addiction, it can be good to replace it with something because you need that sort of buzz somehow. And like guys getting into, it used to be the thing in Alcoholics Anonymous that everyone smoked cigarettes, drank coffee, and ate a lot of sugar. And you'll still hear people recommending to sort of eat sugar, when you're trying to get sober. So you've got something. Whereas other people say, no, 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 there's an addictive pathway, and that feeds the addictive pathway. If you do one thing, you're more likely to do other things too. Where do you sit with that one?
Well, I'm probably in the latter camp, but I will qualify. So basically, sugar lights up the nucleus accumbens like drugs and alcohol. It's highly addictive, and depending upon again that person's unique wiring, it can be as tormenting as any drug. Um, so I wouldn't recommend things. And cigarettes are very deadly. Even though they kill slowly, they kill a lot of people. So those are the types of things I wouldn't recommend as sort of replacement addictions, so to speak, or cross addictions. Um, I think better are sort of again these sort of secondary dopamine sources where you have to do the work up front, while guarding against getting addicted to something like exercise or whatever it is, getting addicted to work. But you're absolutely right. I do agree that in general, sort of people with an addiction vulnerable temperament are strivers, people who maybe need more challenge or need more problems to solve. And if that can be appropriately channeled, it can be an absolutely amazing thing. And if not, it can be very self and other destructive. If you look at it from a kind of evolutionary perspective, I mean, you can imagine that in a time of scarcity and danger, people with this addiction, let's say propensity, would be the most valuable members of a tribe, right? Because they would be the ones willing to run further, sacrifice more to get the things that we need to survive. Whereas now it's really more of a liability because we live in this world of overabundance.
Let's go there. So the world we live in isn't an accident. It is particularly the sort of online world. It's designed for profit in mind. The Facebook want to keep us there. That's their advertising model. Food is made increasingly palatable in ways that it doesn't appear in nature. So it's hard to, once you pop, you can't stop when it comes to Pringles. That's the design of those foods, right? Computer games, and even as someone who's meditated for years, been in sobriety for years, I found myself very vulnerable to social media. Didn't bring out the best in me at all as a person. I have gone sober, as it were, from that now. Computer games, you wouldn't have thought it, but even as someone that's really into sort of mindfulness practices and meditation, these kind of things, I've got hooked on computer games, cryptocurrency trading, all these modern versions of it. This environment is made by people with names and addresses. This environment, I mean, should we be bombing Facebook HQ? This is my Irish side coming out. It's not, it's a harmful environment that is being created around us for profit. And yet we act as if, well, we have to do some self-binding strategies and try and be sober. What's your take on the fact that we're in a whole society of addiction now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think it is a collective problem. We can't just rely on an individual's willpower to try to solve this problem. We have to come together collectively, recognize that we live in a drugified ecosystem that conspires against our own health and well-being, and come up with collective solutions, which is why, I have been a vocal advocate from early on of de-digitizing education, getting smartphones out of K through 12 schools, emphasizing ways of learning that don't involve technology or screens alongside, the ones that do. Um, I'm a big proponent of collective gatherings where where adults choose to not bring their devices. So there are, for example, you see this in some theatrical, comics sometimes do this, some sporting events, golf in particular. People aren't allowed in with their devices. And people talk about these events as quote unquote spiritual experiences, which shows you how spiritually deprived we are, because we're always stimulating our reward pathways with these hits of dopamine. So both, I'm optimistic that we're going to get there. I don't think that it's fair to think about, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook as like the individual who's perpetrating this. I mean, this is the natural outcome of successful capitalism, right? A successful capitalist system will
They're
turn
still
us.
morally responsible, surely. I mean, if you run a tobacco company knowing the harm it does today, yes, people still smoke. I'm not saying smoking should be banned, but we wouldn't exactly think well of our friend if they were the head of marketing for, the tobacco core of London or whatever, right? Yeah, yeah.
I
Should we
I
not see
agree.
these people in the
Yes,
same light?
I absolutely see them as responsible, but I'm not convinced like they set out to get people addicted. I mean, I think they set out to make money like every other company that's setting out to make money. And I think they were shockingly successful because the medium is the massage, as McClure would say, and it's so cognitively adherent and reinforcing. And I don't think anybody well, I think,
They knew it. They did know. They did know. There's internal
yeah,
memos. I don't want to
yeah,
get too
yeah,
conspiratorial here, but it's pretty
yeah.
well documented. They're aware of the harmful impact
Oh
of,
yes,
say,
no,
social media on young women, like
oh, they
lying.
know now. They know now, and they've known for a while. So don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. I'm not, but I don't think at the very inception of, whenever that was in the last century, like, oh, maybe, I mean, I don't think the beginning with email was like, oh, people are going to get addicted to email. I'm addicted to email. So, it happened. I'm not on social media because I know that I wouldn't be able to tolerate it. But I mean, yeah, so I agree with you. And I do think they should be held responsible and also have to pay. I mean, I think they should have to pay for the harm. I think they should have to pay for some of the changes that we need to redress the harms, the abatement. For example, I personally don't think that children should be on the internet before about the age of 14, 15, or 16, that they shouldn't have devices. I mean, I have quite an extreme view on this. I think that it's very harmful for the developing brain. It's inherently addictive. And I think that the companies that make and profit from these digital media should have to provide the funding to create the infrastructure that, for example, verifies age so that we know that the people who are going online are ready for that experience.
Yeah, we are in a way all complicit. I've been researching how to make good YouTube videos, and they're like, well, you've got to keep people hooked, and you've got to tease them at the beginning and leave an incomplete loop. And now I know these strategies. I'm like, oh, well, do I use those? We're all involved in this system in some way
Yeah.
or another. So, I get that there's a shared responsibility here. Um, there's also features, isn't there, of things like social media? You outline the fact that they're readily available, that there's an endless scroll. There's certain features that you outline that tend to make this modern psycho environment particularly addictive.
Yeah, so that the bottomless bowls, there's this illusion of getting things done in the medium, but in fact, we're never finished. There's the enumerification, the way that we give things a number, which I think really does make them more reinforcing and rewarding for people, whether it's the number of likes, the number of followers, the number of shared comments, the ranking in a video game, that kind of quantification. By the way, that quantification can also make exercise and sports more addictive, right? The way that people now count
Yeah.
themselves, they
Yeah.
have their smartwatches, they share on a leaderboard, even like youth sports now, a middle school track runner used to just be comparing herself to like the three other girls on her team. Now she can compare her times to people all over the world. Oh, who else in seventh grade is running, a mile this fast? And those kind of invidious comparisons, really lead to, dysphoria, to feeling less than, and then that cycle of then having to do more or create more content or run faster or whatever it is in order to kind of keep up or get ahead. That's a really big feature. And then of course, the animation and the music and the confetti and the lights, it's all very stimulating, goes right from our visual cortex to the reward centers, and it feels good. Its story is reinforcing, all of it feels good.
Groups like AA and NA are quite big on two things in terms of mm, reducing some of the vulnerability to addiction. One is the sort of social connection. It's a group, there's rituals that are quite church-like. I've always enjoyed those as a recovering Catholic. And then there's the spiritual element. You have to have a higher power. It's one of the few things that's out there that has this deep spiritual element. I wonder if our sort of there's a spiritual malaise in our materialistic Western culture that makes us particularly vulnerable to addiction, or is that just me being a hippie?
Oh, no, not at all. So, way back in the day, the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous were, as you know, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob. And at one point, Dr. Bob, I think it was Dr. Bob, wrote a letter to Carl Jung, a European Freudian psychoanalyst, and said, what do you think is the cause of addiction? And Carl Jung wrote back, it's a spiritual malaise. I mean, it's the absence of spirituality. It's a form of false worship. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, we're looking for connection with each other, connection with something greater than ourselves. And in the absence of that connection, we self-soothe with these various forms of auto-stimulation.
Your book has a subtitle, The Age of Indulgence, in the Age of Indulgence. And often when I've heard you speak in other places, you've sounded almost Buddhist in a sort of calling for renunciation and self-binding and different strategies. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised by that. I thought, oh, she's a professor from California. It's going to be all liberal. I I want to bring politics in a little bit. We live in this sort of, perhaps right-wing economical world, but certainly culturally, we're the most left-wing society maybe that's ever existed in many ways. We're the most liberal in that sense. Do we need more conservative restraint to balance out the culture?
Well, what I say is that in Buddha's time, taking the middle path between pleasure and pain made a lot of sense. In our time, I think you have to actually lean into pain in order to be healthy, because we are surrounded by so many pleasurable stimuli at the touch of a finger. And so I do think that to be healthy today, we have to invoke a new modern form of asceticism where we intentionally eschew or avoid too much pleasure. We can still indulge, but we have to indulge in moderation, and we have to leave enough time in between for our brains to restore and reset so we don't get into that vicious cycle of that dopamine deficit state. And that we need to intentionally make our lives less convenient. We need to pursue things that are hard, because the default is that we can just sit on the couch and have everything, I mean, I'm talking about people living in wealthy modern nations, have everything just sort of delivered. And that's really a recipe for unhappiness. Um, and I think this plays out in a lot of different ways. The way we raise our children, we have this idea that if our children experience any kind of suffering or discomfort, they're going to be on the psychoanalyst couch in their adulthood trying to sort out all their PTSD. That's a very modern idea. Um, you know, a couple generations ago, people generally believed that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, that both physical and mental suffering had both physical and spiritual benefits. You know, in the 1850s, when general anesthesia was first invented, the leading surgeons of the day actually rejected it because they believed that their patients would heal faster if they had some pain during surgery. Now, of course, that's an extreme view that we don't embrace today. But ironically, in the midst of the opioid epidemic, more and more surgeons are experimenting with using non-opioid analgesia, using other forms
Mm.
of non-addictive analgesia, or using opioids for much shorter duration, and finding that indeed their patients are healing better and faster in the absence or in the reduction of opioids. So that's all, it's sort of coming full circle.
It's pretty hardcore, isn't it? I was in this America recently during the election time, and even in Austin, which is a fairly wealthy city, I'd go around the corner from the gym and there'd be these crack addicts, in weird positions and people on very serious opiates that were, I've had pretty, reasonable, let's say, drug addiction, but these guys are in another place, and I really felt for them.
Yeah.
It looks rough on the streets in the States, really rough. And mm,
Yeah, it's very sad. And, I think there a civilized culture would not let people suffer in that way,
right.
right? We would recognize that nobody would choose that that's not a lifestyle choice, right? That's some kind of hijacked process, hijacked brain process, a brain disease, a cultural, societal disease, and that, we need to step in.
It's fully holistic as it were, but it strikes me your work's quite a nice balance of left and right or political. Like America seems very divided, Britain a bit less so, but it's still there across Europe, that division. And on the one hand, I I hear that compassion and that sense of like, hey, people's circumstances really matters and people don't choose these things, which I always think of the sort of compassionate left with that kind of way of thinking. And on the other hand, it's like, hey, maybe we should be a bit less indulgent and practice a bit more restraint. And, community really matters and spirituality really matters. That strikes me as a healthy integration of those two kind of divided poles. I'm not sure if that's a take you've had before. Does that resonate at all, or is this all my fancy?
No, I think that's. I mean, I appreciate that observation. Thank you. That I think I try to address the universal aspects that everybody can relate to, and I think in this day and age, almost everybody can relate to addiction, either in themselves or a loved one. And I think it's a problem that both sides of the aisle acknowledge and are eager to address. I think there are a lot of differences of opinion around what the solution should be, but I don't think there's any difference of opinion around the fact that we have a serious problem of addiction.
Do we need an ethical or a moral dimension in looking at addiction? So that was in some ways the sort of old-fashioned view, moral weakness and often with not much compassion. And then a more medicalized view, kind of modernity, has that idea everything has causes and conditions. So, quite deterministic sometimes at times. And that can create compassion, like, hey, maybe you've got a gene, maybe it's the trauma you've suffered, those kind of things. But I've also seen people with addiction do really shitty things. I've done really shitty things. I've definitely seen really shitty things. The horror of addiction for me is you do things that are below the level of your moral development, and
Right,
you can't bloody stop yourself. There's a
right.
real horror in that. So there is this moral component. I've also heard you talk about responsibility. So how do those things fit together?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we need to embrace the disease model of addiction, that it is a brain disease. Why? Because we have evidence of brain changes that occur when people expose their brains for long periods of time to addictive substances and behaviors. And because, just from a practical point of view, when we embrace addiction as a disease and, try to treat it within the house of medicine, people actually get better. So when people actively engage in treatment, we have response rates that are on par with the response rates that we see with depression and other mental health disorders like anxiety, and also things like obesity and for certain forms of heart disease and asthma. Having said that, people with cancer do not, as a result of their disease, go out and lie, cheat, and steal. Whereas those are the sequelae of being addicted. And because we are social creatures trying to live communally here, uh, people have to take responsibility for those bad actions, even if we appreciate that it happened in the context of their disease process. So I think they're responsible. I think there need to be consequences. I think that though the consequences need to be understood in the context of the disease. And that we have to create a path for making amends. So, for example, I'm in general in favor of things like drug courts, right, where people can they either get a felony and go to jail or prison, or they can choose to enter into an addiction treatment instead of getting a felony, instead of serving jail time. Of course, depending upon the transgression, that would change. Some horrific crime, it wouldn't really, you couldn't just skip going to prison. But I think this is really important. It doesn't have to be either or. Either it's a brain disease or it's a moral problem. I think we can integrate these things and say it is a brain disease, but it's a unique brain disease that is associated with these moral transgressions,
Mm.
crimes, and there has to be there should be some degree of shame and regret for those transgressions, and people need a path for doing better.
You talk about healthy shame. I know often people say, "Oh, don't shame me," like all shame is bad, and this very individualistic way of looking at things. But there is such a thing as healthy shame, right?
Yes, I think that's really important, that shame is a very pro-social emotion. When it's taken to the extreme, it's paralyzing and it just feeds the addictive process as people try to escape the the horrible feeling of shame that it is. But on the other hand, if they felt no shame at all, they wouldn't be motivated to change their behavior. And that's true for all of us, right? We have to get in touch with our shame as a way to be better people, to treat people better, to change ourselves for the good.
It strikes me that addiction requires this sort of sophisticated integration of like free will determinism, which can often fall both sides of the aisle, and also a sort of holistic integration. So, psychology, biology, sociology. As this is the embodiment coaching podcast, let's talk about the body. What's the role of the body and maybe dissociation too in addiction?
I agree with you. I think addiction is fascinating precisely because it is a brain disease and it's sociocultural as well. It's interpersonal. The whole free will and determinism. Do we have agency? Are we responsible? Those are all really important things. I guess in terms of the body, I mean, do you have a specific question? I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, it's quite broad, isn't it? So, I mean, it seems like sometimes addictions are used to numb the body, like this is sort of
Mm.
gabor mate. People are traumatized, it feels unpleasant, so they numb it. And then also, I've seen body practices used very healthily. Like, I've seen people use body practices like yoga in order, martial arts for me was the beginning of my
Mm.
sobriety, in order to gain some sense of self-control, to be able to regulate myself through the body, as it were. So, yeah, just whatever you want to jam on that theme.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, one thing that I find really interesting is that the neurotransmitter dopamine, as we've talked about, is essential for pleasure, reward, and motivation, but it's also one of the primary neurotransmitters involved in movement. For example, various movement disorders like Parkinson's disease are characterized by a depletion of dopamine in a different part of the brain called the substantia nigra. So we really think of addiction as a disconnect between the body and the brain, a disconnect between the purpose that dopamine serves in terms of propelling the body to do the work to get the reward, and so therefore in recovery, one of the main goals is to reconnect the reward pathway and the body in a healthy way, right? And then movement really becomes medicine, where we're now connecting the work of dopamine to move the body with the work to get these healthier rewards rather than the kind of instantaneous dopamine flooding that we get from drugs that simulate movement but don't really have, require the effort that something like, yoga or martial arts, as you mentioned, would require.
It seems working with addiction can be pretty tough. I know this from sponsoring a few people. You've done way much more work in this field than I have. Sometimes I find I have to see the funny side of it. There's a sort of, yeah, and it's nice that you laughed. I wasn't sure how you take this question. Like, what's the funny side of addiction? Because it does seem ridiculous at times.
Oh, there's so much humor. There's so much humor. I mean, first of all, I use humor a lot in my clinical work, and you have to be judicious about it. You can't laugh. You have to mirror people's affect. But people are relieved when you can also joke because it is like so awful, and there are so many horrible things that happen. And, you have to be able to be like, oh, yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. And I think a good way to do that is to universalize it. Like in my work, I almost never use like the I and you pronouns anymore. Speaking of a world of pronouns, I try to use a we pronoun. So I talk about, so often my patients assume that I'm like in recovery from drug or alcohol
Uh,
addiction. I have my little behavioral addictions, which I talk about in my book, but not those. But they assume because I'll say, well, yeah, well, when we're chasing that feeling from alcohol, so and then it sort of it kind of calms the whole thing down. It's like, yeah, we're all human, we're all messed up and neurotic, we've got our things, and like let's just talk about how we can do better, including laughing about it, because I think when we can laugh, then we can also forgive ourselves, forgive other people.
mm, mm. Do you think there are any sort of out there frames on addiction that can be helpful? For example, I've had animist friend talk about being, possessed by demons, and I thought, well, this isn't, my scientific rational worldview, but it kind of makes sense subjectively, and most of our ancestors were animists, so there's probably something in it. Are there any other perspectives on addiction you think are sort of underdone or that are a bit out there but might have a use?
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand, this is a friend of yours with an addiction who understood his addiction as like a devil possession or a
Yeah, yeah, and
possession
sort
of
of
a spirit.
half seriously,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
had a frame of, and I can relate to that. There's some sense of that as a
Yeah.
story, if not as a, objective reality.
Right. And you don't even have to go back to like paganism or anything. I mean, even as recently as the 18th century, the concept of sin was very different than we think of it now. So we think of sin now as like the thing that the bad person does. But really, for most of the last 2,000 years, the concept of sin was that sin is embedded in human nature, right? We are all by nature sinful. And one way to think of that is we all can be, possessed by the devil or have the devil sitting on our shoulder whispering. So, we just have a different frame now. We have this medical model, but it's the same idea. And I think it's great that your friend is kind of just using what's useful for them. Other interesting ideas I've heard is someone talking about addiction as like a mind virus, similar to if you're in your computer program got a virus. And that's very nice too, because it really speaks to the ways in which we cannot engage objectively with our own addiction. We cannot see the behavior. It's our programming has been corrupted by this virus, and hence we become unreliable readers of the data of our own lives. I think that's a good one.
Yeah, just remembering some comical stories of denying various kinds of addiction, despite the sort of overwhelming
Yes,
evidence that my friends were
yes.
gently pointing out. It's like, oh, just think, Mark. Uh, yeah, I feel like as someone who's long-term sober, it's a little bit arrogant, but I feel like I've been ahead of the game and the rest of the world's caught up because, I may have had a genetic and trauma-based propensity to addiction that I had to deal with at a young age. It's been quite a few years now. And it pops up in other ways, but I kind of have the tools now, it's like, okay, I need to spend more time in nature. I need to connect with other people more, get the oxytocin flowing. I need to I know things I can do. And it feels like the rest of the world's caught up with me through the technology, through the sort of pace of the modern world, through perhaps the spiritual malaise of the modern world. So, what can the normies learn from the addicts?
Oh, yeah, I love that. I have a good friend and theologian, Kent Dunnington, who says that addicts are modern day prophets who show us who we really are. And I think that's so great and so true. Like if a person with a genetic propensity or an early childhood, risk propensity for addiction can get into long-term recovery, then surely the rest of us can figure it out, right? Because people who are able to do that really do accrue a deep wisdom that we can all benefit from. And, I've heard so many people in recovery say that they're actually grateful for their early addiction. And were it not for that addiction, they would not have walked the path of spiritual wisdom or life wisdom that they've been forced to walk as a means of survival. Like they wouldn't have made it otherwise. Most of us can afford to live our lives without having to do that hard work or look in those dark places. Because we're not going to die, but people with addiction, they're going to die if they don't figure that stuff out. So that is some powerful stuff, and I really see people with addiction as modern day prophets.
Mm, mm. Advice to listeners. So there's people out there, they've got their little addictions. They're probably not hardcore crack addicts if they're listening to this, but they probably have a phone problem. They might have a porn problem. Well done, by the way, for not relapsing when you went on Chris Williamson. He is very attractive. If I'd have been into romance, no, apparently he was on the cover of a few romance novels. So well done, not
Oh my
relapsing
God.
there. So what would be? He's very good, Chris. He's very good. Shout out to Chris. So what would be your advice to the listeners that have like, the sort of normal addictions, as it were, of the modern age, so they can be a bit healthier?
Well, I have just really simple, practical advice, which is to do an experiment and give up that substance or that behavior for 30 days. Why 30 days? Because on average, that's the amount of time it takes for our brains to begin to reset the reward pathways. And once we've reset those reward pathways, or at least begun to do that, then we are much better observers of true cause and effect. We're able to sort of look at that behavior and say, hey, I don't like what that's doing to me or to my life or to my relationships, which, by the way, we really cannot do objectively or accurately when we're in our addiction. But the biggest thing I have to warn people of is that they are going to feel worse before they feel better. A lot of times people stop using and they're like, well, I feel terrible. So my behaviors must be treating, self-medicating my underlying depression or anxiety or whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is you will inevitably feel better, feel worse, right? When you stop, because you'll plummet into that dopamine deficit state. Your brain will be screaming out for that exogenous dopamine, and it will take a while for your brain to get the message, oh, I'm not getting it from outside anymore. I have to start regenerating my own. Again, the first 10 to 14 days are hell. But if people can make it to about week 3 or 4, it's not like their addiction is cured, but they begin to feel better. There's a little more hope, and they begin to see that there's a possibility of another way of living. Um, I just had somebody, write me and said that for so long, they were struggling with their cannabis addiction and just couldn't figure out why they felt so low mood wise whenever they tried to stop. And then so always went back to it because they felt like crap. But that understanding this basic neuroscience of the homeostasis and the pleasure pain balance made them realize, oh, okay, I'm in a dopamine deficit state, but if I can just wait long enough and come
Yes, this
out of
isn't
that,
permanent.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
not
this
it's not
is
a
gonna suck
permanent
for just a
condition.
week or two, and
Yeah,
then it's gonna get
right.
better.
And it
Yeah.
feels permanent when you're in it, and the
Oh yeah.
craving is overwhelming, and you feel like I'm not going to make it. I can't live like this. But you can just wait. It's withdrawal mediated. It gets better. Give it time. And so that's my practical advice to folks.
Yeah, anyone listening out there, it does get better, and it sucks until it doesn't. And then
Yes.
I've seen so many times people come in after a month of sobriety and say, "Hey, I was really enjoying the bird singing, my
Right.
kids playing. Why?" And I'm like, "Because your dopamine's reset, and now you can enjoy normal
Right.
things. High five."
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's great.
what keeps you going with this? I mean, it's a fairly dark abyss to stare into some days, right? I know it has its humor and its absurdity, maybe sort of philosophically, but what keeps you going?
Oh my gosh, I love my patients. They give me a lot of hope. They're very wise. I mean, I'm biased probably, but I think people with addiction tend to be smarter than the average person. And when they get into recovery, they're really remarkable people. They're often brilliant and insightful. And it's so exciting when they get better because not only are they better, but it has a huge ripple effect on everybody on the folks who live with them, who love them. They often go on to do amazing things. And when I say amazing, I'm not talking about like winning awards, blah, blah, blah. I'm just talking about like having rich, meaningful lives, full of people they love and who love them. And so it's actually not depressing work at all. It's
Mm,
super inspiring work. I feel such a sense of privilege that people let me into their lives, and also a huge amount of admiration for people who get into recovery because it is hard. It is really, really hard. It's hard to get there. It's like, jumping across the chasm of the Grand Canyon. And it's hard to stay there in this dopamine overloaded world that we live in.
mm. Mine tends to just pop up in different ways, and it starts causing some damage, and then I then have to spot it and go, oh, I got addicted to a computer game. Oh, it's
Right.
crypto
Yeah.
trading now. Oh, it's social media making me a dick. And I just have to, it's like whack-a-mole. I have to keep hitting it with the hammer and kind of noticing and doing the things. But it also gives me that motivation to do things that, some people do yoga because they enjoy it. I do it because I have to. Like it gives me a great motivator. It's like this is a life sentence, but it's also
Mhm.
a hell of a gift. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like we're coming to a close here. If there was one thing in the world you could change to make people less prone to addiction or the culture less prone to addiction, what might that be?
I mean, I am really concerned about the way that we are investing so much of our time, energy, and creativity into the metaverse. And I guess, taking the world as it is, and not trying to reimagine some other world. I really hope that going forward, we can recognize the need for internet-free communal spaces
Mm,
that are strictly and with great enforcement and discipline, not connected to, to anything or anyone outside the people present in that particular lived space. I
yeah.
just think we're not going to make it otherwise.
Right. We can't make the world better if we can't face it, right? Like that's
Yeah,
that's thing number
that's right.
one.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you. I've enjoyed snorting a big line of Dr. Lemke. And my girlfriend's going to
You're
get me.
very funny.
Thank you. I get told that a lot. It's a coping mechanism for many people with addiction. And yeah,
That's a
my
good
girlfriend's
one.
going to get me back now, which she'll be happy about. Before we do, where do people go to find you? You've got a new workbook out. Is that right? Like people can, I
Yes.
mean, the
Yes.
book, everyone should read the book, literally sending copies to all my mates. I know
Oh,
Stephen
thanks.
Bartlett from Diary of a CEO said, wow, this is one of the most impactful podcasts for him and his team. I couldn't
Oh,
agree more.
great.
But
Great.
yeah, where do people go to find you and your stuff, Anna?
Well, not surprisingly, I'm not on social media because I wouldn't be able to handle it. So I think to find out more about me, read the book. I share about myself, and my wonderful patients were generous enough to share their stories. And so that's a good place.
Okay, remember, listeners, she didn't say track down the CEO of Facebook, but I did. So you heard it here first. Cheers.